Hi there. I'd like to make a few comments about week 3 in general, and then a few comments that are more specific to each component of the questions you were asked to respond to. So first of all, a couple recommendations. Please respond to each part of the question as I give it to you. So in this week, there were 4 parts to the essay question. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let me urge you to respond to each part of the essay separately. Some of you just wrote a general essay, and it was difficult for me to glean from what you've written the particular responses to each part. And some of you, I think, just got a little unfocused in your writing because you weren't following question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. So respond to each question separately, and please label in your essay which section of your essay is responding to which question. That's very helpful, I think, for you to stay on track and easier for me to record and grade. Also, when you're submitting your work, please save your document, and it should be a single document that includes your internet work and your essay. Save that document with your last name first, dot, and the week number. So this week it would be Dieter.week3 for me. And when you send your work in the Dropbox, send it as an attachment. Some of you are still failing to send the attachment, and so I get a blank file. So be careful about those things. So let's talk about week 3. What I wanted from you is not only to learn a little bit about Congress, a little more, I hope, but also to have some practice in critical evaluation skills. So this week was about comparing and contrasting 2 essays. And so while I wanted you to learn about Congress, I also wanted you to learn how to critically evaluate these essays. So in the first question, I asked you about the authors themselves. Who are they? What's their background? And why is it important to know that? And most of you did a pretty good job on this. You identified Lee Hamilton as a long-serving member of Congress, of the House from Indiana, 34 years, and who had also served as the head of several commissions, including the 9/11 Commission, after leaving Congress. Norm Ornstein is a member of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a slightly conservative organization, though he is somewhat liberal. He also works for several news agencies, and so when you think about Hamilton and Ornstein, why is it important to know their backgrounds? Well, Hamilton might be defensive of the institution of Congress because he's served there for so long, but at the same time, he has insight that very few people have. So knowing both those things is important. Ornstein, on the other hand, works for a think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, as well as news agencies, and he's much more likely to be critical of the institution of Congress. So it doesn't mean that either one of them is necessarily biased because you know that information about them, but you should be alert to the fact that they may be biased. And some of you too quickly jumped to the conclusion that they were biased. So be careful about that. On the second question, I asked you to, what did I ask you to do? I asked you to briefly summarize the two essays, and most of you did quite a good job on this. Ornstein, of course, was highly critical of Congress, believed that it was corrupt to the core. Lee Hamilton said that despite public criticism, essentially Congress is a hard-working, honest institution. Pretty easy. In question 3, I asked you to identify 3 pieces of evidence to support that were written in support of the essays. And most of you did quite well on Ornstein because he identifies a lot of examples of corruption in Congress. Some of you had a little bit of difficulty with Hamilton because he did give some specific examples. So he starts his essay, for example, talking about when Wilbur Mills passed away, a long-serving member of Congress. The newscaster who talked about him focused almost exclusively on a scandal that he was involved in and said almost nothing of the legislation that he had worked very hard to pass over the years. So there's an example in which it's exactly what Hamilton is saying. Here is a person who's worked very honestly and hard in Congress, and yet He's remembered for a single scandal. There are other pieces of logic that Hamilton uses in his argument that can be perceived of as evidence. So he says that the public criticized the slow-moving process of Congress, but Hamilton says this is the way it's supposed to be. That's what the founders intended. So here you don't have an example of, in the case of Ornstein, corruption, but you have some logic that can be used as evidence. And some of you had some difficulty, and you just made assumptions that the comments of one of the authors was evidence. So Darrell says, it's really hot today. Well, that's not really evidence, it's just what Darrell said. Now, if someone else said what Darrell said really is true, that lends a little bit of credence to what I've said. But simply taking my comment as the gospel truth is not necessarily evidence. Some of you had some difficulty with that and just assumed that anything an author says is necessarily evidence, and that's not the case. So by part 3, you have talked about the background of the authors, explained their argument, and identified pieces of evidence. In part 4, I was asking you to weigh that evidence. Which one, on a balance, which one is more convincing? And that can be a little bit difficult, but either way, if you came on the side of Hamilton, came down on the side of Hamilton or Ornstein, it didn't matter. I wanted you to go through the process of critical evaluation. And so, while I wanted you to learn about Congress and two people's perspectives on Congress, I also wanted you to learn about the process of critically evaluating two different essays. And most of you did a pretty good job. But I did this video so that you fully understand what my intentions were and what my expectations were.